This is episode 190 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, this is a historic day for the oil markets, at least in either of our lifetimes, and I think really in the history of the market. To make a very long story very simple, you can now buy a barrel of oil for cheaper than you can fill up at the local gas station for a gallon of gasoline.
Yeah, so another way of saying it is that if you have storage capacity, not only will they give you the oil for free, they will pay you $37 to take that oil off their hands. And so this is not going to last a long time. It has to do with how the futures market works. And as these futures contracts come to a close, they tend to get very close to what the actual commodity price is, except for one or two little things. One, we have a huge supply of oil out there. There's almost no demand because of COVID-19, and there's nowhere for the oil to go. And so these contracts have to be unwound, and it took oil into the huge negatives today. So,
yeah, and most people that you talk to who are familiar with oil markets will say that prices will rebound into the positive territory.
$19 or $20 in the next several days.
Which is kind of where we were before. But of course, all of this is contingent on businesses starting to open. We're seeing some states, including Texas, make a real push for that. Of course, we're a ways away from any of that happening here in New Mexico. Not that, if you're going to pick a state, you definitely rather have Texas open and its much bigger, stronger economy as opposed to New Mexico. But it's going to be a very long time, it seems, before we get back to any semblance of normalcy in New Mexico or around the country. Certainly when it comes to travel and people using these products, which the sale of which makes up 40% of New Mexico's budget. And that's where the rubber hits the road here.
Yeah, and I've said it many times, is that were it not for COVID-19, we would be talking about the oil and gas market almost full time. It's that important to the economy of the state of New Mexico. And the fact that, small businesses out there are hurting so bad by not being deemed to be worthy of being open during this crisis, so-called non-essential businesses, that's actually gone on top of it. But from an economic point of view, in terms of recovery, both are going to be huge to the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It is going to be very ugly and very interesting to see how things do start to try to get back to normal. And of course, normal just means people able to go to the grocery store and actually walk through it without a mask on, or maybe a mask on for the time being. Whatever that new normal is, we're in unprecedented times with regard to New Mexico's state budget on the oil price alone. Now, happy soon-to-be Earth Day, Wally.
Well, happy Earth Day to you.
With all of the things going on in the world, the 50th anniversary or the 50th commemoration of Earth Day, that's coming up Wednesday. So very... we would be hearing nonstop about it in the media, let's put it that way, if it wasn't for everything else going on in the world. Now, because of the coronavirus, we are seeing the aforementioned collapse in the consumption of oil and gas. Wouldn't say utilities have been very affected. It would be interesting to see. I think electricity consumption's probably gone up, at least in a lot of households, but our business is using as much. But that's academic. The point is that there's been some articles in commemoration of Earth Day during the coronavirus talking about how we're going to see some steep drops this year in CO2 emissions. Of course, the U.S. economy saw a net decline, countering all the experts' expectations that we were going to see, CO2 emissions just rise dramatically as soon as Donald Trump got into office. It was going to be game on for CO2 emissions. Now, I've seen 5% or so this year. I think that's on the low side. I actually think we might be closer to 10% overall reduction. Now, maybe I'm unduly pessimistic about the pace of opening of the economy and the pace of people being willing to get on trains and the need to drive places if they're not open, whatever. I posted on Heirs of Enchantment something a few weeks ago about this being the Green New Deal that we're in, except for, as you would expect, Green New Deal, the AOC and the people pushing that would love to see $5 a barrel gasoline. Instead, we're going to be seeing dramatically lower prices of gasoline at the pump, but it's the ability to travel that we're missing out on. So the demand is plummeted, and we're seeing soon, as we go on, massive changes in mobility, the economy, and everything that affects the use of natural resources and the emission of CO2 into the atmosphere. Of course, the environmentalists are saying we don't need 5% this year. We need 7% for about
year.
5 years before we do what needs to be done, and that's compounding change to actually address the climate issues. Now, as somebody who is agnostic on the seriousness and significance of climate change driven by man-made causes, I don't think people want to see a future that involves the kind of limits on person-to-person contact and travel that we're seeing right now, let alone something that would be multiples worse, as the environmentalists seem to say that we need. Now, even they want technology, and we would gladly consider nuclear technology. I think environmentalists need to really consider encouraging policies that involve telecommuting and working from home. But the fact is that we are in what you could say is the glory days of the green movement right now in terms of CO2 emissions. It's never enough, and they're going to be pushing for more and more reductions. I just don't think it's realistic, and I don't think the American people or the people around the globe will stand for that kind of thing.
Well, and I do think the market-oriented approach to emissions has been actually working relatively well in the United States. On a downward trend for CO2e, the carbon dioxide equivalents that takes into account carbon dioxide plus methane and other greenhouse gases, that's been going relatively well in our country at a time at which our energy production in the area of oil and gas production has really grown tremendously to where we're up there amongst the largest producers in the world now. And depending on who's keeping score, one or two, and we're there really close. So all of that's happened at that point in time. The other thing that's interesting is there's a lot of things that have been championed as ways to be more quote unquote green, some of which I really have my suspicions about, particularly if we take a look really close to home in New Mexico. Public transportation, supposedly very green, but when you don't have a high ridership level, you're basically taking big diesel engines, whether it's something like the Rail Runner or the ART or just a bus in Albuquerque, and putting a few people on there. You may be, in many, many cases, better off from a greenhouse gas point of view being just in a regular automobile, the four-door sedan Honda Accord. And then the other thing is that the high density population and high public transportation, those have been pushed as the way for the green movement for humanity. Boy, both of those really in the what we're seeing now with COVID-19, those are two of the worst things to have in terms of mitigating the spread of this pandemic, the coronavirus. So the places that have a lot of public transportation and have a lot of density, all things being considered, have a lot more COVID-19 infection.
Yeah, there's so many points to be made here. First and foremost, just looking at worldometers.com or .info, where they track the COVID-19 uh, outbreak and cases. They go into a state by state situation, and at least currently, as of this recording, New York is more than double any other state on a per deaths per million population. And I'm told by multiple people that that is almost exclusively in New York City. So you've got a big state surrounding New York that's relatively unaffected. New Jersey's the next most, and Connecticut, all kind of bedroom states, if you will, with New York. And so the density, the use of transit, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But on September the 22nd, 2018, Heirs of Enchantment, Dowd Muska noted that telecommuting had surpassed, so as of 2018, mass transit, the New York subway, Washington subway, BART, and all the other transit systems combined as a percentage of the overall market share. Working from home had exceeded mass transit in 2018. And again, if the environmentalists have half a brain, they will be encouraging tax credits and other policies that further take people off the street to use this momentum that we've seen for teleworking. With the technology we have today and expected technological advances, the idea of working at home, I think, is going to be much more attractive and common occurrence for a lot of people, Wally.
Yes, there's this thing in technology from the early days of personal computers called the killer app. So a platform, whether it be the PC, the IBM PC, or then later the Apple and the Mac, they needed applications to grow. Well, the killer app for the green movement had been public transportation. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that that's been proven to not be the killer app, and I do think that the killer app is
killer in a different sort of way.
Yes, no, and I mean killer in the app that made the tech. Yes, we're not. It was. I didn't pick the metaphor there. Thank you, but no, the killer app, the application that really could change the energy efficiency of the entire economy, may have an appearance much more like a Zoom meeting than it does a big bus.
Yeah, sorry to throw
you
that's
okay.
under the proverbial bus.
I
so
deserve
to, speak,
to be thrown under the bus.
But I'm actually looking at an article dated April 16th, 2020, from the Washington Examiner. Is mass transit dead? Speaking of killing and killers, it mostly spends its time talking about the New York subway, which was among the primary vectors in New York, where the outbreak has been especially problematic. But right here in New Mexico, the rail runner's been sitting on the sidelines for several weeks now. The ART has been taken off the roads. Buses are still there, but you go down the road where they run, which is predominantly along Central. Anywhere around town, buses are not really being heavily used. There's not many people on them. And can you blame them? I mean, it's explicitly against so many guidelines that you're supposed to be in a confined space with people. And this is not exactly, hey, look, a lot of folks who use the bus, there's a lot of homeless population that uses the bus, a lot of folks who may be living pretty challenging lives. And while, there's challenges to deal with them as a general rule, the last thing most people want to do is go sit on a bus in a confined space with a lot of them.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it doesn't matter how nice the bus is. It's in that confined space. And, and let's just say mass transit, let's just talk about another one, is airline travel. Airline travel is dramatically reduced, hugely reduced. So it's, as I understand it, not illegal to get on an airplane. Nobody will do it. Not nobody, but
just about, yes.
Yeah, just about nobody. So, I live in one of the flight paths to the airport, and it was vaguely brought back memories of 9/11 when you didn't hear any airplanes. So you'll hear one every now and then, but not that many. So mass transit is in a huge they're in a huge world of hurt. How long will they recover, if ever? And then as companies get better and better at doing telecommuting, Zoom meetings, sharing of data that way, will that ever recover? You know, the only one that I would put in as challenged of a situation is over the next 5, 10, 15 years is the airline industry would be a one that's a different model, but just as problematic, and that's the cruise line industry. You know, so it's like once you get on a cruise line, if there's an outbreak, you sometimes don't get off for a long time.
Right. Well, you don't think of airplanes as mass transit because they're not nearly as beloved by the environmentalists as other forms of transit tend to be, but they do involve not just the same space, but the same air recirculated. And I think there will be a lot of folks who may be not inclined to get on airplanes. There is no replacement for airplanes. Certainly, international travel gets very tricky to fly around without, or get around without airplanes. And even, traveling across the country, especially as we get back to a more normal time frame where people are pressed for time, spending 3, 4, 5 days in a vehicle driving coast to coast and whatnot is increasingly unattractive. But you're absolutely right about airlines. And the other thing, we've talked about oil and how it's experiencing both supply and demand shocks. Well, mass transit is incredibly expensive. We've talked about the Rail Runner and how its fare box recovery ratio is about 10%. So it is heavily subsidized to the tune of 90% of the operating expenses, not to mention the amount of money that it took to build the thing. Now, you've got that sunk cost fallacy that looms large, but are governments going to want to keep these systems going at the price point that they are for them, with regard to other government services, other possible policy outcomes, raising taxes or cutting, teacher pay or something like that? I mean, you ultimately have some very unattractive trade-offs, and I think transit's not going to come out ahead on a lot of those, especially in places where they're really never important, like New Mexico. Maybe New York City subway, they have to do something to keep that system going.
Yeah, I agree with you, and not to beat the dead horse here, but in the last 5, 6, 8 years, when people talk about having meetings where we're all going to fly somewhere and have a meeting on an important topic, maybe one time out of 100 you would hear, hey, is there another way to do that? Could we maybe get on the phone? Could we maybe do Zoom, GoToMeeting, use one of the other software programs? Very, very rarely. I believe that that's going to be the trade-off then. And so what does government have to do to use a Zoom meeting relative to keeping the Rail Runner going? They don't have to do anything. So it's one of those things that you're right. Economics is about trade-off for scarce resources under any circumstances. And given the challenges that government's going to have, it will be very interesting to hear what the arguments and what the logic is relative to should programs like the Rail Runner and the ART receive their big subsidies, or can we just do it another way, do without?
Yeah, and the Rail Runner survived the economic shutdown or downturn of 2008, 2009. Kind of a broad financial crisis, certainly impacted New Mexico for the better part of the next decade. But if I was a betting man, I would say this potentially is the Waterloo for the Rail Runner. Ironically, it could be under a Democrat governor, but we'll see. She is not even talking about the economy at this point. And speaking of which, one of the unattractive, at least to us, and hopefully the governor politically as well, potential alternatives to cutting projects like the Rail Runner is raising taxes. So the Rio Grande Foundation is circulating a pledge for legislators or legislative candidates. All 112 of them are up this year. It's available at riograndefoundation.org/pledge, and they can go read through that, make sure they agree with it, and then send a note to info, I-N-F-O, at riograndefoundation.org, letting us know that you want to have your name there saying that you're not going to raise taxes as a consequence of the coronavirus shutdown. I'm a believer that the private sector has already paid more than enough steep price for this virus shutdown. Government has been modestly affected. Certainly teachers aren't teaching in classrooms, but most people who work in education, government employees, are still getting paid. There's not been a significant impact on a lot of these folks. So riograndefoundation.org/pledge. We basically say that from now until the end of the 2021 legislative session, so that'll be the 60-day session after the election, no tax increases. We are not going to raise the net tax burden. That means, you could reduce something and increase something else, but it has to be on net, break even, or a tax cut. Now, we're not
revenue neutral, they call it. Is that one of the terms? So
we're not advocating that tax cuts be in the offing, so I suspect that we're not going to see many or any of those, but we do not think that our hardworking businesses need to be put on the chopping block yet again for higher taxes. So I would encourage anyone running for the legislature to sign this and put your stamp out there saying, I oppose raising taxes due to the coronavirus. We have had libertarians, Republicans, and even a handful of Democrats jump on board and do this, take the pledge. So very excited about that particular project.
Yes, and a point that I've made in previous podcasts, this is a good policy to not raise taxes during this time. Absolutely. But let's just say that deep down you really want to raise taxes. You want to get more money to the government. I'm not sure raising taxes in the environment we're going to find ourselves coming out of over the next months and years, whether there's anything that would even work. Gross receipts taxes are already very high, but gross receipts are very low because of the types of businesses that can be open. Income taxes, personal income tax aside, where people get basically W-2 employees, there's some income there, but the businesses, there's not a business out there that hasn't been hurt that's headquartered in New Mexico.
You have to have income to tax.
Exactly. If you have no income, there's net income, there's no tax. People have talked in the past about raising the oil and gas production taxes. Well, what? There's is really, we just talked, we have negative oil prices. So
if you have a tax that is based on the percentage of how much you're selling it for, the price, does that mean
do they give you money?
Are you cashing checks now with negative oil prices? Who knows? Deep thoughts.
These are deep, yes, deep thoughts. The answer is probably no.
Probably no, yes.
But it is a very bad thing to raise taxes in the environment we find ourselves, because we need to recover. On the podcast, talked a lot about the lost decade from the 2007, 2008 in terms of just getting back to where we were. If we do some of these crazy things like raising taxes on the private sector as we come out of this thing, you could get to the point where you make 2 or 3 bad decisions and you get to the point where you can't recover. And organizations, not states, have gone bankrupt, but political organizations larger than the state of New Mexico have gone bankrupt before. So it is not impossible.
And I mean, not to go too far down the path of worst case scenario.
Yeah, no, we don't. Yeah.
But the fact is that states and local governments are going to be hurting. There's no question. They really should not raise taxes, even if they can or do. And even if they do raise taxes, they're probably still going to be way in the red in general. So that means they're going to come with their hands out to Washington, D.C. and Congress, which, by the way, I'm not going to say that we're $30 trillion in the red at this point in terms of the debt, but we're getting very close to $30 trillion. At what point does the federal government step in, but at what point does the federal government's financial situation become a real crisis that international investors and people say, I'm just not giving more money to the U.S. federal government because they are way, way too in hock and they're getting far worse very, very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've seen it in smaller countries. We've seen it in Greece and Venezuela, a little bit in Italy. We've seen countries do things, but not one that is as large and has the historical history, the history of prosperity and actually not doing too many crazy things, at least in the modern era.
Right. And back to New Mexico, the Mercatus Center. So they're a free market think tank associated with George Mason University. They're pretty on the libertarian side. They're definitely on our side in general. But they did a 50-state report. So they ranked. They didn't have a political axe to grind here. The fiscal balance sheets of various states, and they looked at a handful of different metrics. The one that jumped out to me is service level solvency. This is from 2018. You can find it on the Mercatus.org website. You can find New Mexico's ranking of 45th overall. But the service level solvency, reading directly from the report, measures how high taxes, revenues, and spending are when compared to state personal income. So how much blood is still in that proverbial turnip? Do states have enough fiscal slack? If spending commitments demand more revenues, are states in a good position to increase taxes without harming the economy? New Mexico ranks 50th, and that was in 2018. So New Mexico had very little in the way of money available for a bigger share for the government. Now, Wally, we're going to move right along here because time is of the essence and we have more economic carnage to report. Although the folks at Bernalillo County don't see any clouds in the horizon. They passed a 7% budget increase just last week. Now, we're recording this on 420, so I could make a insert marijuana joke here. I don't know what's going on at Bernalillo County, but I've got news for them. You're not going to be anywhere near 7% in terms of your budget increase. And they've got hiring thrown in there. They've got all kinds of stuff. Basically just saying, economy's not really changing at all in this here county or state. And it's worth noting, of course, that 40% of the state's gross receipts tax revenue comes from oil and gas directly, or 40% of the state's revenue, including gross receipts, I should say, comes from oil and gas. Bernalillo County gets money directly and indirectly through the gross receipts tax, through the oil and gas industry. Of course, the shutdown has been painful as well. I just don't get it where they come up with a 7% budget increase at Bernalillo County, Wally.
Well, and right now there is a time warp happening with regard to government entities, state, county, local, municipalities. They're going to face a lot of the same issues that the private sector is facing now. I think they're telling themselves, just from comments, little snippets in the media, that somehow the federal government will bail them out. Well, there will be some federal bailout money. There already has been. There will be some more. But it's not enough to keep a state like New Mexico's state budget whole, keep the Bernalillo County budget whole, keep the Albuquerque city budget whole, and have funds for all these small businesses that have just been decimated, all the unemployment, all the things that are happening. There will be shared pain. There will be. There's just without a doubt. There has to be, yeah. There has to be. And, to go ahead and put that in there, I don't know. I think it just sends a bad signal. They might have been better off saying, we're going to keep it as it was, and we know that may not be enough, but we're going to not raise it any. Now, I did see the, quote, reason for that was, we'd worked on that budget a long time. So it's like, yeah, there you go. It's out the door. So,
and this is the budget that's coming up. I think they're on the same wavelength.
Yeah, so they start July 1. Yeah.
But, we could see some opening, but we're nowhere close to being back on even footing. Now, KOB TV had a story, and it was covered pretty widely. around the state. City of Albuquerque faces budget shortfall due to COVID-19 crisis. Now they're talking about the current budget situation. Now this is the most, quite frankly, shared sacrifice we've seen, which is pretty pitiful because government has, in New Mexico, the government way is, as we've discussed, government takes care of its own itself, and private sector be damned. We'll do whatever we have to do to keep the bureaucrats paid. But City of Albuquerque is already, quote, limiting all hiring with the exception of public safety. Okay. All travel for the remainder of the year is canceled. Well, that one's a tough one. I'm assuming this is, I guess they're talking calendar year. You don't get clarification sometimes, fiscal year versus a calendar year.
But nobody's wanting to fly anywhere in April and May. Let's put
at
it
least
that
for the
way.
time being. Yes, Clarissa Pena is going to stay close to home.
Yes.
All city contracts with vendors are being reviewed and cut if necessary, and the mayor has ordered his department heads to find cost-saving measures. So that is what dealing with the situation looks like at the City of Albuquerque level. 22 million is where the shortfall is currently. The mayor says he's hoping the city will receive about $150 million in federal relief aid to plug the shortfall. The money is not guaranteed. But, you know, the way I'm looking at this situation, I realize that this is why I don't get elected to offices. I haven't tried yet, but why I would be not particularly attractive to a lot of folks is because, you know, this is the kind of situation where they should be thoroughly addressing the problem right now. Paring back pay raises, looking at additional programs and government projects that can be cut to save money, not hitching your star to a prospective $150 million payment from the feds, not to mention the fact that the fiscal pain is not going to be done end of June, early July. It's going to last for a while, so you want to make that prospective $150 million last as long as humanly possible.
Yeah, without a doubt. You know, we have purposefully not done worst case scenarios, but man, best case scenario does not have the city of Albuquerque having anything but slower economic activity in July, August, September of this year. If things go absolutely spectacularly, it'll still be a huge slowdown.
Yeah. Now, you know, the city's got a homeless shelter that they want to build. I don't think that's a wise move. Of course, by the end of this crisis, a lot more people could be homeless and not of their own volition, and that's a realistic thing to consider. But you know, maybe we should be doing things now to make that less of a problem down the road. And I that's where I think a lot of this whole discussion about opening the economy or not opening it is not being really thought through by the folks who want to close things up. Nobody's going to come along and force you out of your house if you don't think it's safe or that you want to do it. But there's a lot of people who want to get back to work and who are just being absolutely prevented from doing so by government dictates. And it's a very, very challenging situation, and it's going to come back to haunt us as these budgets are shredded, whether it's the city or the county or state, whoever it might be. Now, we went into some detail last week about the 8 shutdown decisions Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham should reconsider right now. Those are available on our website. We're not going through those, although it's worth noting that they received a record response in terms of website traffic, social media. It was blowing up. It was very, very well received. A couple of developments relating to that. First and foremost, Calibers is a gun shop here in Albuquerque. They received a cease and desist order from the governor. They had been open for curbside service for average people, you and myself.
Right.
They have a shooting range that was available for, you know, police and members of various government agencies who needed to use shooting range.
And they've kept that open.
That had been kept open.
As opposed to drive-by shooting. That's not the way they went. So
well, you can we could man, Wally, you're something else today. I'm at a loss for words. But the fact is, they've been shut down, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
Cease and desist, and they're obeying with it means they're no longer open for anybody at any time right now. I know they're selling some gift cards online, but that is one of the 8 that we said should be reversed.
Right.
Is, the gun stores and people along those lines, not just Second Amendment, but again, selling a physically solid piece of equipment is something that you can pretty much do without heightened levels of social contact. And then another issue, and we didn't include car washes, and I think car washes are wonderful service providers, and they can also be done with limited social contact. But Superior Express Car Wash in Artesia was shut down by the state police. There's no one there to contact. It's one of those just drive up and throw
put
the
your
money
quarters
Yeah.
in or put your dollar in. And
Right. It's an automated wash. Why shut it down? And I think that is worth noting. And then very sensitive, because police, I appreciate them as adult human beings. Attending a funeral that was covered on the front page of the Albuquerque Journal, clearly not engaged. These are APD officers not engaged in social distancing, no mask, no nothing. And, I do think it's a unique position because these people are charged with government people like Tim Keller, in this case, APD, with shutting businesses and enforcing laws and shutting down playgrounds as they have. I really think that was a very questionable situation, and I respect, your buddy died. I think police are adults. They should be free as human beings to take that risk because I believe in human freedom. But you're hearing crickets out of Mayor Keller, the governor, whereas, if you or I are to do something that they're considered irresponsible, hell, they're tracking our cell phone data, not as individuals, but broadly speaking, to make very important decisions. And it seems like there is a double standard. I think that's what we're getting at with all of these policies, the 8 reconsiderations that should be made and others, is that there is a huge double standard taking effect here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and people are predisposed right now to look for those idiosyncrasies between what those in power say should be done and what they're making those who are having to be subjected to these rules do. And so, yes, there's a heightened sense of awareness. I think
as well there should be. Because
well, that's human nature. That is human nature right there. But yes.
But we're taking remember the budget? Well, this is the Constitution being shredded in many ways. There's no pandemic exemption for the Constitution. And yes, I appreciate the desire of our political leaders to try to limit the spread of this virus. But on the other hand, we are individual human beings, and damn it, we have these rights. And it doesn't say, oh, if there's a really big emergency, we just put the whole Constitution on hold for a while, whether it's a war or a pandemic.
Well, and then, to even go one step further, I think that these efforts have been wildly successful. The number of deaths and the number of cases in New Mexico compared to what the early models were just, 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks ago compared to what we're actually seeing is we are seeing success in that regard.
Well, and that is a discussion for a different podcast.
Yes.
But you can say, yes, we had success through the social distancing, or you can say, well, New Mexico is wide open space, less subway travel.
Oh, yeah, it could be good luck.
Well, it's not good luck. It's just reality of New Mexico versus New York. I mean, you look at the numbers coming out of New York, and it's very scary, New York City especially, whereas we have wide open spaces. We have the sun, which sun breaks it down. You have vitamin D strengthening the immune system. I'm not going to not give the governor any credit.
Oh,
here
no, not at all.
Her the social distancing and trying to do that, but at some point you have to allow businesses to innovate, to address the social distancing, and take some level of risk in order to start getting our society and our economy back in something resembling normalcy.
No, and I agree with that, but I do want to say that there is still a little bit of luck. Picture a world where the balloon fiesta was in February.
True.
What New Mexico would have looked like. It's just one of those people from all over the world came here. Would we be doing as well?
That's true.
Probably not. And so right now we are doing well for a wide variety of purposes or reasons, some of which we will not know literally for decades, as they have to go back and study and as testing comes about. But we are in a position where you can contemplate extremely strongly now what is the plan to open back up certain businesses. What are the phases for multiple businesses, multiple phases over time? The time for that is absolutely right now.
And we don't think of them as businesses, but we did mention them in our 8 points. The first Catholic archbishop in the nation, Bishop Peter Baldacchino of Las Cruces. So there's a diocese in Las Cruces. And dioceses are essentially governing bodies underneath the Roman Catholic Church. I'm Catholic, full disclosure. Albuquerque's in Santa Fe Archdiocese, and then Gallup has their own. But Baldacchino is taking a more aggressive stance. He wrote a letter on April the 15th to priests and folks in that district to allow outdoor services with people in cars or services inside churches with no more than 5 people present practicing social distancing. He says both of these would comply with the governor's restrictions on public gatherings, and it'll be interesting to see how that situation develops. But it's good to see somebody right here in New Mexico taking a little bit of a stance contrary to the powers that be and sticking their necks out and saying, we're going to try to get something back close to normal. Wally, we're doing this edition of Tipping Point New Mexico. We have pretty unlimited time here as long as the listeners choose to tune in because of everything going on. But we are going to go into a more rapid fire round. It is worth noting that the Republicans, GOP, statewide here in New Mexico, on a unanimous decision, got the Supreme Court to deny Democrats, broadly speaking, but some county clerks, et cetera, who wanted to do exclusively mail-in voting for the primary. We talked about this fairly extensively on another podcast, but the thing that really got me is that the governor made a statement in reaction on Twitter saying, in reaction to this decision by the court, which is a Democrat-dominated court. There's one Republican, Nakamura, who's on the state Supreme Court, but the other 4 members are all Democrats, but they all unanimously agreed mail-in voting, not the way to do the primary election. Governor says in-person voting poses a grave threat of heightened transmission of COVID-19. I remain confident New Mexico's primary election can be conducted almost entirely, if not entirely, through mail to ensure the safest possible exercise of New Mexicans' right to vote. That election is June the 2nd. Now, what we were just talking about here. So you on one hand, it's important about the election itself, but the fact that the governor is saying grave threat of heightened transmission leads me to believe that April 30th ain't going to be the end of this whole shutdown in New Mexico.
Well, and if it's a grave threat in June, maybe May 31st is not the date of the shutdown as well. I don't know.
Ding, ding, ding. Yeah.
Yes.
So I don't know where this is all taking us. I, for one, will gladly show up in person in doing the early voting.
Well, and I was going to say, without early voting, this could be a huge issue.
I agree.
Early voting was made for social separation.
Yes. Early voting is a very easy opportunity for most people. And remember, we're not talking about a general election
A
here.
presidential general election.
We're talking about a primary with neither party has a competitive presidential election. You know, Trump
Right.
has it in the bag, Biden has it in the bag. So there's a handful of primaries out there at the party level, but really we're not talking about the kind of turnout that you're going to see. I mean, I'm not even sure if my Albuquerque ballot I'll have any races to really deal with. So I suspect turnout will be low enough in general, and then a lot of people will do what they can getting absentee ballots and everything worthwhile. But very interesting. I think that quote from the governor points to her vision of a very significant, kind of restricted lockdown for a very long time in the state.
Yeah, and I wonder whether it's a lockdown or is this a political calculus relative to voting?
True.
You just have to wonder.
Right.
Because
Democrats do want mail-in. They want more liberal elections, and mail-in ballots just go to everybody. Absentees, you have to request them.
Right. And so it's very interesting. The politics are there, and we've talked about that a little bit. And I'll say it again, I do think that if we are going to more of a absentee, mail-in, whatever, if there's not confidence among the voters, and among the voters, I mean the voters in both parties, not just the party in power, that's basically, the sanctity of elections is at the core of our democratic republic. And if that's cast into doubt, called into doubt, huge problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Moving on, Trip Stelnicki, he is the governor's spokesman, still employed, I believe. Haven't seen any announcements. But he tweeted and made at least New Mexico headlines. Don't know about national or international. This is a direct quote of his tweet. "You don't have to ask the death cult their opinion on publish their quotes. False equivalence now is actually life or death. There is no both sides to this. There is one group preaching accelerated illness and death because they, quote, love business. And if you can't see through that, question mark." Again, Wally, I would say that this is pointing to a very one-sided approach. I mean, they directly say it. False equivalence is literally life or death. I just see the governor as being in a hunker down. I'm not going to try to open things up, do anything innovative here. We're just going to wait as long as it takes, whatever that may be.
Yes, and when you work for the governor during these times, I'm sure he's a tired individual. And I'm going to go ahead and just say, maybe he was a little too tired and he was a little too frustrated.
Having a bad day.
He was having a bad day. There's no doubt that what is the goal here? The goal here is to mitigate the spread of this disease to the maximum extent possible, doing the minimum damage to the entire rest of the economy. The point is that in economic decisions, and this is it's a medical decision, it's a public health decision, but believe me, it's an economic decision as well, is that we know we could shut down everything and people would starve. No one would die of COVID-19. They would all die of starvation. They would die of homelessness. They would die of despair. No one's advocating for that on the side that's just totally focused on the shutdown. But the people who, like us, are saying, let's look at how we might start to move things to open it up. We're not saying that we don't think this is an issue that needs management or attention. We're saying that the economy is important, and it's not worth bankrupting our state and bankrupting multiple generations of New Mexicans for something that is, by all outward appearances, compared to what they said it was going to be, going very, very well. The number of deaths, the number of cases compared to other places, the healthcare system has made adjustments. There's a lot that's going extremely well, is the reason we say we can look at this now. We're not New York City.
I'm pleased to be in your death cult, Wally.
Oh, I am not in a death cult. I'm in a life cult. And this is the other thing that came to mind earlier in the podcast is that to use a one-size-fits-all approach for anything tends to have anomalies come out. Yep. And so we're doing the same thing across the entire United States, does that mean that we should have the same rules apply to New York City that apply to Union County, New Mexico, that, you can't find people there because they don't live there? So there's a whole relative set of decisions. And even in New Mexico, there are places that have virtually no issue with COVID-19. The rules there might be relaxed more quickly and they can get through the phases quicker, whereas places like McKinley County that are suffering from some challenges with this, they might need to be under more strict rules for longer. New Mexico's not a uniform place. It's one of those where it's very large, it's very diverse, there's lots of regions, and there's lots of outcomes. And to just say, let's just shut down everything because New Mexicans aren't sophisticated enough to know whether they're in a high risk or a low risk area, or we have one size fits all, I don't think that's the answer.
Yeah, and continuing with This Week in Twitter, Representative Javier Gonzalez, who, in my opinion, is very troubling that this person has made its way into position of leadership in the House of Representatives. He's the chair, really technically co-chair, but more or less the chair of the House Tax Committee because the other gentleman is leaving, Trujillo. And he tweeted, "Years of policies that uphold," this is again a direct quote, "that uphold historically racist systems like failures to invest land grant fund in youngest kids, failures," apologizing for the tweet language here, "failures to build water systems in communities without failures to build an economy that works for all are a big part of the reason why COVID-19 is hitting us the hardest," speaking of minority groups. Now, there is a lot to unpack there, and we don't have the time, but he was in the same crowd. He is one of those pre-K will solve everything types of people. And the idea, again, that not tapping into New Mexico's permanent fund to expand early childhood education and pre-K is somehow racist, is really a theme that he has carried and a lot of folks in this state have carried. And I just wanted to make sure that folks know that these are the kinds of people who are in charge of the state of New Mexico. This is a committee chair of one of the most powerful committees in the legislature, and very troubling. So the idea that we shouldn't raise taxes is, I think, shared by you and I and many right-thinking people, not just conservatives, but moderate Democrats and even some probably pretty liberal Democrats around our state. But this guy has been elected by folks in his district, and he's made his way up the ladder enough that he has great control over tax policy in the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, and it brings up an interesting question. A lot of times the Land Grant Permanent Fund and the Severance Tax Permanent Fund are called the rainy day funds. They are not rainy day funds. We have reserves that we talked about earlier in the podcast with that. They are specifically, in the case of Land Grant Fund, have specific beneficiaries, basically schools being the primary one. And you can't just go and change the purpose for those funds without constitutional amendment. And as I understand it, probably Congress would have to sign off on it as well, because these funds go all the way back to the time that New Mexico was let in to be a state. And so if we're going to tap these for anything, and believe me, if there were a time that you might say that some funds might need to be tapped to treat these as rainy day funds, it may be in the next coming years, but it may be for things well beyond early childhood education. And so I've never been a huge fan of the quote, tap these funds. I think it's added a lot of stability to the state of New Mexico having them there. But it will be interesting to see, just like we talked about, if we're not going to raise taxes, what else do we do? What other funding sources are available? We can cut employment in the state, but even that a lot of times doesn't quickly. There's severance payments and other things. That's not a real quick one. What other funds are there? Those are certainly big funds. I don't think they can be gotten at very quickly and easily.
Yeah.
But if this thing is a long time to recover, years, then maybe that might be a source. Who knows? I'm not advocating for that, but I'm just saying maybe.
Well,
one that I do want them to go after,
Okay.
that capital that they've allocated and that is not spent. Take that and say, all those are off the table. We're going to start over. We're going to need that flexibility as a legislature to make this budget balance and to not raise taxes while we get the state back on track.
Yeah, and it might be worth doing another podcast. We did a deep dive into discussing the permanent funds
Right.
A few months ago on the podcast, and I think it's something that, first and foremost, the Rio Grande Foundation has not precluded. It, by definition, is a lengthy process. You've got to get Congress to act. You've got to get
It
a vote
literally takes an act of Congress.
a vote of people, the people, to amend the Constitution, and you've got to get the legislature on board as well. So anything dealing with the permanent funds is going to take some time. Certainly pre-K, we've already been spending a lot of money. I've got to think that some of that money is going to be pulled back, but those are decisions that are going to be made whenever Michelle and the legislature decide to actually start grabbing the budget problems by the horns. They are not even doing that. And the idea that you call somebody racist for not wanting to tap the permanent fund, I think, is very problematic. And it shows you kind of the folks that we have elected to, quote, lead New Mexico. And hopefully folks in this state will get a little smarter in terms of the folks that they put up there. Whatever the party is, you can't have people who see the world in such a prism, such a unfortunate, there's racism, there's all kinds of issues in our state and in our nation, but just because somebody disagrees with you on a policy decision doesn't make them a racist. And it doesn't make them a bad person either. So, folks, we went a little long today, but dang it, there is a lot going on in our state and our nation, and we want to cover it right here on Tipping Point, New Mexico. So thanks, Wally, for spending some extra time with me. And thank you for listening to this week's podcast and tuning in on Facebook Live and wherever else you are able to get access to this podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point, New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show. Sorry.